Well, joining me now in the studio is former New Zealand Prime Minister and former head of the United Nations Development Programme, Helen Clark. Kia ora, Helen, thanks for being in here today.
Thank you.
Well, I want to talk to you about Donald Trump. We are 4 months into the second Trump presidency. How do you think it's going?
Well, it's been a roller coaster ride, hasn't it? Not only for the US itself, but also for the world. From New Zealand point of view, we don't need the 10% tariffs.
Of course not, no.
But then there's been other major changes in the foreign assistance of the US, which we could talk about for a long time. There's also been what will Trump do with respect to the Gaza war? What will he do with respect to the Ukraine war? There's been all the deportations with the masked men and the balaclavas. There's the assaults on science, on the universities. So a headline every day, but maybe that's what President Trump thrives on.
Yes, yeah. Would you say that he's dangerous?
Is he dangerous? He's unpredictable. Sometimes he will surprise. For example, the comment the other day that children in Gaza are starving, and that may have propelled his envoy to go back in and have another go at a ceasefire, and it seems there are discussions.
Did you think that was a rare moment of humanity from him? There
is some humanity. Also with the latest major assaults on Ukraine, he made the comment about Putin is killing a lot of people and I don't like that. But next test, what will you do about it? So he keeps us on our toes, he keeps us all guessing.
I want to come back to Ukraine and to Gaza. We've just seen in the last day President Trump's sidekick, Elon Musk, say that he is pulling away from the White House, that he is finishing his work there. He didn't like Donald Trump's budget and said that it undermined the work that he did with DOGE. Elon Musk cut $44 billion of USAID as someone that headed up the United Nations Development Programme. What was your gut reaction when that news came through?
My gut reaction was that a lot of people are going to die of preventable causes.
So their actions, President Trump and Elon Musk's actions, will kill people?
Oh, already have, because when they first dismantled USAID and said to everyone who had any contract with the US government for development and humanitarian assistance, stop, even if it's in the fridge, stop, you can't use it. And then a few days or weeks later, they said, if it's life-saving treatment, you can use it. But the message never got out to the back of beyond. And so people have died because they haven't had their medications.
So you're saying that when that edict came through, there were 8 agencies that had, say, HIV medication, AIDS medication in the fridge, and then they thought they were not allowed to hand that out, and so people that needed it have died. You know of specific cases?
I'm told of specific cases. Nick Kristof wrote, for example, of people in South Sudan who had seen a mother and a child, both dead since his visit. So what I hear from UNAIDS is that people have died. So yes, a lot of the life-saving medicine was restored while they review the whole budget, but many more people will die if there's an ongoing and permanent cut.
Do you think that we will see globally a resurgence of the HIV/AIDS epidemic?
Yes, the estimates are that if the funding cuts stay as they have been, that by 2029, 4 years away, we would have over 6 million more cases of HIV and 4 million more deaths. That's how dramatic it is.
4 million more deaths?
Yeah.
Because of this cut in aid funding?
And with TB, the estimate was that you would get more than 10 million more cases and over 2 million more deaths. So it is very dramatic. Now, one hopes that the Congress, which in the past has been bilateral bipartisan around HIV, TB, malaria funding, will step in and force a better compromise. But if there's not a change, millions will die.
So those estimates that you're hearing, 4 million deaths from HIV and 2 million from tuberculosis, so we're looking at 6 million deaths. Do you think that President Trump and Elon Musk should be sleeping easily at night knowing those figures?
No, they shouldn't sleep easily. Look, if countries had been given more time to adjust, you might have avoided the worst consequences. The problem was the boom came down instantly. I was in one African country in March where roughly 10% of their government budget came from US funding. They had no idea how they were going to fill that hole, and around 4 million of the $6 million they were getting was keeping 1.3 million people on antiretrovirals with HIV.
For HIV,
so,
yes.
You know, what they were faced with was, how do I fill this hole immediately? How do I try and find the money in a heavily indebted country, spending more on debt servicing than health and education? How do I find the money to keep people alive? Simple as that.
Elon Musk announced yesterday that he's stepping away from the White House. He doesn't like Trump's budget, thinks it's undermining the cost-cutting that he's been doing. Is the bromance over?
Look, at the very beginning I said there wasn't enough room in Washington DC for both President Trump and Elon Musk, and we know who was going to go out of that. I think what's happened to his share prices has probably been a factor. He's also been what's called a special government advisor, and I think they can only do 120 days a year, and he's coming towards the end of that. But then they wouldn't get him confirmed, I suspect, through a normal process.
And so what? Because I wondered if there was a subtext maybe that we aren't seeing. And is that it, that they know they can't get him across the line officially?
I think they'd be reluctant to go to Congress for approval.
They've got a few other people through.
Well, sometimes they use the out of session to push people through, but that might have been a step too far.
Okay.
So he was in there on a special status, and that's time limited. But let's face it, Tesla's taken a huge hit.
At Trump's inauguration, in your view, did Elon Musk do a Nazi salute?
Well, it looked like it. You know, and what's the old saying? If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck.
And so if you saw him do that and you thought that is Elon Musk doing a Nazi salute, like many people around the world also thought, how did you feel about that?
No, I felt chilled, actually. There's a lot that's going on in the world today that makes one think it might have felt like this in the 1930s. We're seeing the surge of the populist authoritarian right, if you like. Winning a lot of seats in parliaments in Europe, for example. So this is a concern. It's a bit chilling. Look, if someone at a New Zealand rally gave a salute like that, what would we think? We would think, hang on a minute. What are you trying to say here? It brings back, memories of a genocide in the lead up to and during World War II.
Now, you have been all over the world, even in just the last few months, the World Economic Forum in Davos, Norway's International Development Conference, the Munich Security Conference, the World Health Summit in Delhi, meetings in Tanzania, Angola, Zambia, Geneva, Hiroshima, Kuala Lumpur. You are well placed to read the room in a global sense. What are you seeing and hearing about President Trump?
So it's interesting. In Davos, it was the very first week of the administration. And it's fair to say that most business seemed quite happy at the prospect of less tax and less regulation, as John Key was.
I was going to say, just like our other former Prime Minister, John Key, would have said he'll be good for the economy, was what John Key said.
And then, of course, tech companies saw their shares drop away. But anyway, the governments and the think tanks and the scientists and everyone were worried. The Munich Security Conference was really very, very strange. I mean, Europe was shell-shocked by the statements that had come from the Secretary of Defence and then from J.D. Vance at the conference itself. So in Europe, everyone's talking about Trump and the impact on them, and of course the tariffs are heavy. But when I went to Delhi for the World Health Summit, it was quite refreshing in a way that no one was talking about Trump. You're in a large emerging economy, it's making its luck, it's very confident, and it was like a different reality.
So they're pretending that he's not a problem because they're big enough maybe to not have to worry about America? Is any country big enough not to have to worry about America?
Well, look, it's like every big country is an important trade partner for everyone else. So India's important as a market. It's important for America. America is important to India. Yes, all of that is true. But also, in a sense, they have a large and growing domestic economy, as the Chinese do, so they can make their luck.
Let's go back to what they're saying in Europe, because Kamala Harris, during her election campaign, said that world leaders were laughing at Donald Trump, essentially saying that he was a joke behind closed doors. Are they laughing now?
No, they're not laughing, and they wouldn't see him as a joke. President Trump is a disruptor, and he probably quite likes that description. But it is difficult for other leaders and countries to navigate around a disruptive US.
If you can be a little bit less diplomatic for me for a second, what are people actually saying? Is there a fear? Is there, you don't have to attribute the comments to anybody. I'm just really interested in what is happening behind closed doors.
I think it's the unpredictability. So in those dramatic days in February when the Defence Secretary went to Brussels and in effect said that defence of Europe was not America's top priority, which raised the issue of what will happen to NATO, which was formed with the strong American support. The reaction to that was Europe saying, we're on our own. Now, Angela Merkel had said that during the first Trump presidency, but things weren't quite as tense as now. The result of the Hegseth and Vance speeches in Europe were the rush to rearmament in the UK, in Germany, etc. And there's consequences of that. The UK is funding its rearmament by cutting its aid budget 40%. Germany has thrown out its austere fiscal rules to give space for more militarisation. But there will be consequences of this for domestic spending in the European countries.
Well, that's interesting, because so America's cut $44 billion at USAID, and actually some estimates push it up now to about $60 billion US dollars, as well as axing 90% of its aid contracts. And Sir Keir Starmer, as you say, we saw him cut 40% of the UK's aid budget, taking it away from aid and putting it into guns. What does this all say about the state of the world that we are living in today?
Oh, it's pretty sick, actually. And I hope that at some point when the Ukraine war ends, and we don't know when it'll end or how it will end, but it has to end with a bigger security conversation, because Western Europe lived alongside the Soviet Union for decades. It didn't fight it. It had a coexistence where they didn't aim their weapons at each other. Somehow, we have to get back to that situation where these countries aren't bleeding each other to death when there are other more diplomatic paths.
Let's talk about Ukraine for a minute. President Trump, JD Vance in the Oval Office, the showdown with President Zelensky. Do you think that was planned or unplanned? And I guess my question there is, was it a tactic or was it an outburst?
Probably a bit of both. There might have been a bit of talk beforehand, let's rough him up a bit when he comes in, but it then got somewhat out of control, let's say.
Yeah, what did it reveal about the current US administration?
Well, it revealed a different way of hosting world leaders, and I think President Cyril Ramaphosa learned from that.
From South Africa.
And it was a masterclass, really, in how to deal with such a difficult situation. But in the past, you would go to the Oval Office. I've been twice myself. I mean, I think the cameras took sort of shots at the beginning, and then you did your interview outside at the end. And now you go in as a world leader, and it looks like the meeting's conducted in front of Fox News and Truth Social and various others who haven't been banned. I mean, it's a bit terrifying.
Do you think that Trump can play a decisive role in ending the Russian invasion of Ukraine? He talks about his relationship with Putin, but is it an effective one?
Look, I think he can play a big role. I think he can play a big role in ending the Gaza war. He could spend a lot of political capital on doing this. I think President Putin will play him as hard as he can, but I think there's been insight from President Trump that he knows he's been played as well, and he's running out of patience. Now, what does that mean? A whole lot more sanctions. Sanctions haven't been terribly effective in stopping Russia to date, but at some point, its economy's in more difficulties as well. So I think President Trump can make a difference, and if he can end the war on terms that are acceptable to Ukraine, full marks. We all want to see this horrific land war with the modern technology of the killer drones and the long-range bombing. We want to see it end.
Is it acceptable for Trump to tell Ukraine to give up some land to Russia to end the war?
Well, I think that it's better that the negotiations not be conducted in the open like that.
But do you think that would actually be an acceptable way for it to finish, to say Russia can keep the territory that they have gained in the war?
I don't think it's easy for any Ukrainian president to say that they will give up what was sovereign territory. So there may be some other kind of fudge. But very hard for a leader to face his people after the losses that they have suffered and say, I have to give up 20% of the country.
I mean, there is, of course, the precedent of what happened with Crimea, but this would go against the international rules-based order. I mean, Trump has been foreshadowing it, though, for months now, saying that everything's on the table and that they are talking about that. But Helen Clark, do you think that that would be okay?
Well, I think it's very hard for any president to agree to just give up 20% of the country. So there may be a formula that is around a referendum at some point or whatever. The key thing is stop the fighting. Stop the fighting. There may be issues that are left for another generation to solve. Look, the Korean War has never had a peace settlement, but nor has there been a war between the two Koreas since 1953 and the armistice. Could we even get to that?
So what would that potentially look like, leaving the Russian troops and the Russians in the territory where they are now and try and get on with things without actual battles on the front line, and then, as you say, a referendum to the people of Ukraine at some point? Is that what you
you could have an armistice where you freeze things where they are, and that would require probably international supervision, and the Russians are being very critical of having any NATO country forces on territory and so on. But that is the kind of solution which has kept the peace in Korea since 1953. New Zealand's been in that UN force command around the demilitarised zone.
And I just want to clarify, because you're saying that you could see that as a solution, but is that something that you would support?
Well, I support anything that stops the fighting now.
So that would be something you would support?
Stop it now, and that enables a negotiation. And it may be that we accept that a peace settlement isn't possible, but an armistice is.
The United Nations has been almost completely ineffective on both fronts, the war in Ukraine and also with what's happening in Gaza. Do you still have dreams of becoming the UN Secretary General?
Thank God, no.
You don't?
No, because when Antonio Guterres was elected, he took the slot for countries in the grouping New Zealand's in for the next sort of 3 decades, right?
Right, so the rotation means that it wouldn't come back to you.
It doesn't come back to the Western European and others group for another 30 years.
Okay. If you could take that role, what would you do differently to end the war in Gaza and in Ukraine?
Well, you're right that the UN hasn't really been a player. For Ukraine, it's rallied support for humanitarian. It did the Black Sea grain deal with the support of Turkey to get grain out from Russia and Ukraine. But I think that there could be much more active use of good offices by the Secretary General. There could be more shuttle diplomacy. Look, the great powers don't necessarily welcome this either, right? It's hard territory, but I am of the view that for the future, a Secretary General should have one term of 7 years and go for it, because the first 5 years are often spent looking over the shoulder around re-election, and then the second 5 years is almost the swan song. So, we're not in a good situation for people to be able to act decisively.
A couple of quick questions for you. The New Zealand Coalition Government, if you had to rate the performance out of 10, what number would you give it?
2.
A 2 out of 10 for the Coalition Government?
Yep.
Why?
Well, firstly, it's been a very fractured government. I led minority coalition governments for 9 years. I can never remember a minority party leader giving us confidence in supply or in government attacking me as Prime Minister or attacking the government. I've never seen anything like it. And could it have been tolerated? No. But to see it tolerated now, that that leaders of minor parties in government can take pot shots at the PM. I find it quite incredible.
So what do you think Christopher Luxon should be doing about that?
Well, I think that there needs to be much more effective coalition management. Some of the pot shots have come from people not feeling they've been properly informed. For example, the initiative that he took, and it was an okay initiative to ring other leaders about the tariff issues, but you know, as a courtesy, if you're ringing leaders of other countries, I think the Foreign Minister should be told. So that kind of thing creates tension.
So you think Winston Peters was right to give Luxon a sort of slap across the knuckles for going ahead with those talks without letting him know? Because Winston said, leave it up to the experts, didn't he? Leave it up to him.
I think he should have been formally advised. The phone should have been picked up, because he is the Foreign Minister and he's conducting talks with other foreign ministers. And so if your leader is ringing other leaders, you need to know about that, because you just might be making a call to the Foreign Minister of, say, the UK, and this guy says to you, oh, by the way, you know, your PM just rang mine, and you're thinking, hello, did I know about this? I mean, I think really there has not been effective coordination within the government.
You are, of course, a champion of women globally. You're on a number of high-profile board chair positions that you hold. The pay equity law change, a penny for your thoughts.
So the National Party's got form on this, right? I was Minister of Labour in 1990 and saw pay equity legislation through Parliament. And the then finance spokesperson for National said, that law will be gone by Christmas. And by Jove's it was. They won
in 1990?
1990. They won in November and it was gone by Christmas. And the claim that had been lodged by the nurses for a pay equity settlement, gone. So then when I was Prime Minister, Ruth Dyson had another go at pay equity, and there was a mechanism for the public sector. That was gone with the next government. And now they've done it again. But even more outrageous, done it having voted for it. I just don't get it. So I think it's a fair point to make that low-paid women have paid for this budget.
The government has said that they are making the changes to speed things up in the long run for these claims. What do you make of that?
I don't think that's got any substance at all. I think it's going to be very interesting to watch Marilyn Waring's People's Committee, which is going to hear evidence, and just see what people think. I think most people would see it as I do, that poor women paid for the budget.
And just finally, there is a proposed social media ban for under 16s. Do you have a strong position either way? Do you think that kids should be on social media?
I don't have a strong position, and I can see the arguments both sides. There is a lot of bullying and harassment, leading to mental health issues for young people through social media, and the platforms are utterly irresponsible in the way they refuse to curb bad content, for example. They take no responsibility for it. So I can see the case for a ban, but on the other hand, do we think it's really going to stop kids having fake accounts or people setting them up for them, or whatever? So it may not work anyway. I think there has to be a lot more pressure put on the social media platforms. If you go back a number of years, my foundation did a report on this and proposed a form of bespoke regulation, which will be somewhere in between what the Media Council does for print and the Broadcasting Standards Authority does for broadcast media, and to try to get some greater responsibility for how the platforms behave. It
has always boggled my mind that we have those things for the media, but not for anything online. Helen Clark, thank you so much for your time today. Patron, of course, of the Helen Clark Foundation and former Prime Minister of New Zealand. We really appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you.